Hi, I'm Gregory Hodgson here at the 2017 Canadian Science Policy Conference with Gordon McCauley, the current President and CEO of the Centre for Drug Research and Development. So as the leader of such a high-profile organization, what can you tell me about what it's like to fill that role?
Well, it's a spectacular organization. Like any organization I've been involved with, it's all about the people. And we have a really high-quality team of folks. There are 100 people. 75% of them are scientists. And what makes us unique in comparison to most organizations like this, frankly, around the world, is that we actually get the opportunity to get our hands on projects. So, when you have such a strong team and a leadership group that is all from industry and commercially minded, it's an easy job to do. I mean, there are significant challenges out there in the life sciences ecosystem in general. Those are tougher things to think about. Leading this organization is easy because we've got a great team and spectacular facilities that would be the envy of certainly any biotech company in Canada, and I would argue probably any mid-sized biotech company around the world.
So what would you say are the key factors when you're trying to bring new scientific technology to market?
Well, there was a really interesting study done a couple of years ago in Nature, and it looked at a couple of hundred successful drug development organizations that had taken a drug through approval, and it ranked all of the determinants of success. The number one determinant for getting a drug approved is killing a program early. Not because you do, but because what it says about you as a developer. That you ask the tough questions early, that you run studies that are large enough to give you a robust answer, and that when you get that data set, you follow that data set. And the world is full of organizations and frankly full of young biotech companies that don't respect or don't have the opportunity to respect those determinants. So that to me is the single largest advantage that we can bring to the life sciences ecosystem. We've got a team that understands what those questions are. We are really good at designing them, designing studies to answer those questions, and we follow the data. I tell you, one of the smartest people, first people I met in this industry, told me about the rule number one of developing a drug is you start with the label. What's the approvable product profile going to look like, and work your way back from that. And again, that's something that we try and do a lot. It's not always as easy as it sounds, but we try and do that a lot because, again, when you look at the challenges within the ecosystem, they tend to come from not anticipating some of those issues or not anticipating some of the things that aren't terribly interesting. They don't really add any scientific knowledge per se in terms of a paper you might be able to write. They attract no capital, but they're really important things like how are you actually going to manufacture a product? What's the supply chain going to look like? How do you manage all of those sorts of things? Not very exciting, but if you don't think about those things early, you don't know whether or not you actually have a commercial opportunity.
Wow, that's actually a really interesting perspective. So I know that in addition to several positions as a CEO, you also have some experience as a political advisor. So I was wondering if you could tell us, what do you think are some steps that Canada could take towards becoming more of a global leader in science and innovation and in science policy?
Well, I look at it through a slightly more parochial lens of drug development. Science policy is pretty broad. The knowledge I have is more around drug development. And I think there are basically 6 things that we need to do in Canada to assume kind of the dominant or leading role we can play in drug development. And just to put that in context, Canada is 0.5% of the world's population and 5% of its innovative output, on whatever scale you want to choose. Choose a metric. If you want to choose it on citations, on intellectual property, on whatever. We generally speaking punch 10 times above our weight. When you look at the World Intellectual Property Organization data, it says in the measure of innovation inputs, those things like the extraordinary investment in basic research. We're number 10 in the world. Interesting, 5 times our size of economy. We're about 2% of the world's GDP, but number 10 in the world for innovation input. When you look at innovation outputs, the commercial result of those things, we fall to number 23. So it just gives you a context of why an organization like CDRD exists. So what is it we can do to help Canadian life sciences be a leader in the world? First, we work really hard at replicating data. Our own experience is similar to the published literature, that about 2/3 of the things that we get our hands on, we can't replicate. And as you know, as a scientist, there's nothing sinister about that. It's just the nature of science. It sometimes is difficult to replicate. It's the fact, nonetheless, that if you can't replicate it, it has no commercial relevance. So we've actually had venture capitalists coming to us saying, can we use you as a source of replication? And in fact, are tending to send young companies to us to say, go to CDRD and get them to replicate the data for you, and then we'll start to take a serious look. So replication is pretty important. The second thing, as I was saying a moment ago, is to ask the tough questions early. Ask them robustly. Generate data sets that will allow you to follow the data because it gives you answers. And again, I know I'm being cut and dried about it, and science is always gray, but as large a data set as you can generate to get as robust and as unequivocal a result as you can. The third thing, again, I was saying, all of those uninteresting, unexciting things that attract no capital and no real interest, but if you don't do them early and you don't think about them early and understand how it impacts on your potential product, you don't have a product. The fourth thing is spin out companies of scale. I've been involved in a bunch of companies. I've been involved in small ones. I've been involved in large ones. And I know just from the process of raising capital, having raised a couple $100 million around the world, it's just as easy to raise $25 million as it is to raise $250,000. I tell you, it's just as much work one way or the other. So you might as well be raising more money. Similarly, when you're spinning a company out, if you want to attract the talent, you want to attract the capital, you want to attract the interest, there has to be some scale to the opportunity. And one of the things that we've done, and these are mistakes I've made, so I'm not criticizing anybody more than myself, is we've tended to say, well, this has extraordinary market potential, therefore it could be a whole company. Maybe yes, maybe no. The challenge is it also, with that potential on the early stage, comes with an awful lot of risk. So spin out things of scale that can attract the kind of resources that is necessary. This is a tough business, and this is a long runway from conception to approval. So you have to have some diversity there. The fifth thing is we have biotech companies in this country with great potential, but an organization like ours ought to be working with them to help them scale up. It's one of the peculiar things about the biotech industry. One of the things we know is that the companies that are successful, generally speaking, don't end up where they start out going. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons for that is that if you're going to be successful, you're going to follow data, and data takes you in interesting places, and you have to understand where it's taking you. So you don't usually end up where you start out going. At the same time, boards and investors, and I've sat in a bunch of boards and I've been an investor in a bunch of companies, are all saying to the CEO, I want you to focus on one thing. So if you put those two thoughts together, what you have is a board saying to a CEO, we want you to focus on something that probably isn't going to be successful. And so when we look at those companies, and there are a lot of really good ones in this country, they've all got pipeline products and other things that they don't have available resources to dedicate towards them. And so one of the things we try and do is, how can we help them add some value to that pipeline so that they have an opportunity to scale up? In the good news, if a product's wildly successful, they've got the next thing that they can move to. In the bad news, where a product for one reason or another doesn't get there, we've given them a bit of an insurance policy. And then the last thing is talent. our organization has done a great job of training scientists to be more commercially minded. We've graduated almost 200 scientists through this program. 94% of them have gone on to relevant jobs in industry, 85%, something like that, are in Canadian industry. And we know that the reason it's successful is that unlike a typical postdoc or a typical co-op placement where you go deep into one specific area, which is the essence of the process, I'm not being critical of it, it's just that's what people do. When they come to CDRD, they get a breadth of different scientific disciplines they get exposed to. They also get exposed to the business disciplines as well. So they end up being really well-rounded scientists going out into industry. What we want to do now is, while continuing that program, move to helping train business people to be more scientifically minded. Because I would argue the biggest challenge in this industry today is finding that kind of C-level talent, whether it's as a CEO, a CFO, a chief scientific officer, chief commercial, it doesn't really matter. Finding that leadership talent is really, really hard to do. It's also the case that, generally speaking, this is a simplification, but it makes the point, generally speaking, when we have imported that talent from elsewhere, it doesn't work. It doesn't work for a bunch of predictable reasons, but it generally doesn't. So our view is one of the things we ought to do is look at identifying potential leaders of the sort of future biotech companies and creating that sort of training program for them. So that's what I think we need to do from a policy perspective. Happens to be what we do as an organization. Mm-hmm. It's why our vision is being a catalyst for Canadian life sciences leading the world, because if we do those things, we will start to assume the leadership role that we ought to have globally.
That's great. I mean, I really like the last point that you made about turning out scientists and highly qualified personnel in science that have a broader focus and some experience on the business side, but also people who have a background in business, training them, in the basics of science. That's really going to be a catalyst for change for you, and probably a successful strategy.
It's incredibly important because, again, having been involved in a bunch of different businesses and having funded a bunch of different businesses, finding that talent is really hard, and it's also hard to recruit them here. Even generally speaking, if they're coming, we usually have them coming from the Bay Area in California or from Cambridge or around Boston, and generally speaking, they usually want to go back to those markets, so they're kind of coming here as a stepping stone, which isn't necessarily bad, but there are other things that make it difficult even to recruit those people. In Toronto or in Vancouver, the cost of living right now is nutty in terms of finding a place to actually hang your hat and live, and it's also a challenge if you don't have a robust enough cluster that hasn't grown to a size where people come and they say, okay, well, my spouse is involved in the industry too. What are they going to do? And how are we going to find a role for them? So there are a lot of challenges there. So to my way of thinking, let's grow those people. And we turn out spectacular scientists. We turn out spectacular business people. Let's find a mechanism to train them into the industry.
I know from my own perspective as a graduate student in science that, and one that's interested in a career in industry, that kind of experience and that initiative would go a long way. And I really hope that more organizations take that approach across Canada, not just in British Columbia. But before we go, I would like to ask you, I know it's your first time at the CSPC, but so far, what do you think is the greatest value to you of the Canadian Science Policy Conference?
It's a really interesting platform that brings together a whole bunch of folks, people with a more business focus, people with a broader public policy focus, people from the academic community. It's a really interesting mix of people discussing common themes. So I participated in a panel yesterday with colleagues on translation, which is translation of research, which is kind of a good surrogate for all of those broader public policy issues. There are a lot of academic issues there. There are a lot of business issues. There are a lot of public policy issues. So it's a really good forum to bring all of those interests together talk about some of the challenges, talk about some of the solutions, and figure out how we can do productive, practical things to move the industry forward.
One final question. Could you just tell our audience where they might go online to learn more about the CDRD and the topics that we've been discussing?
We'd love for folks to visit our website, which is cdrd.ca. We have terrific information there about the organization in general. We have terrific videos there that show some of what we do and some of our trainee program and what have you. So we'd love for people to come visit us there, or follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn as well.
All right, well, thank you very much for volunteering your time. It's really been a pleasure talking with you.
My pleasure. Thanks for your time.